The highway patrol officer who first arrived at Pine Creek Cemetery that February morning had seen things in 22 years on the job that a man carries with him whether he wants to or not. He had worked floods and fires and the kind of accidents that made him go home and hold his kids a little tighter than usual and not say why. He had stood at the edge of things that had no good name and done what the job required and driven home and tried to leave it behind him. He had never seen anything like this. He had come because of the noise. The sound started at dawn, low and distant, like thunder that had forgotten how to stop. By 7 in the morning, it had become something else entirely, something that lived in the chest cavity rather than the ears, something that made the windows of every house in Pine Creek rattle steadily in their frames. By 8, it was so pervasive that Mavis Aldrich, who was 83 years old and nearly deaf in both ears, woke from a sound sleep and walked to her front window in her housecoat and pressed her palm flat against the glass. She stood there for a long time, feeling the vibration move through her hand like a living current, like the earth itself was trying to say something it had been waiting a long time to say. The officer stood at the entrance to Pine Creek Cemetery and tried to count. He stopped at 500 because counting stopped making sense after that. The procession stretched back along Road 9 as far as he could see, in either direction, a column of chrome and black leather that disappeared around the curve of the mountain like a river with no visible source and no visible end. Motorcycles, hundreds of them, then more still. He got back in his cruiser and picked up the radio. How many, the dispatcher asked. He looked out through the windshield at the sea of machines filling the cemetery road, spilling onto the grass, lining the shoulders of the highway, in both directions as far as the eye could reach. All of them, he said. I think all of them came. He was not entirely wrong. 3,000 motorcycles came to Pine Creek, Colorado that Saturday morning in February of 2014 to bury a woman most of the world had never heard of. They came from California and Utah and Wyoming and Nebraska and from states further than those. They came in clubs and alone and in pairs, old men with white beards and younger men with new tattoos and every combination in between. Clubs that would not ordinarily have been caught within 50 miles of each other rode side by side with their colors lowered. None of them had been asked to come. All of them came anyway. The woman they came to bury had been 74 years old in the winter of 1997 when everything began, which meant she had been 91 by the time they put her in the ground, and the years between had not diminished what she was. She had never ridden a motorcycle. She had never been to a rally or a run or a clubhouse. She stood 5 feet and 2 inches tall and weighed less than 120 pounds and spent her mornings in a rocking chair that had been shaped from a white oak tree by the hands of a man who had loved her for 41 years and wanted the chair to fit her exactly, and it did. Her name was Edna Rose Calloway, and this is the story of what she did on a night in December of 1997 that made 3,000 men ride through a February morning 17 years later to tell her goodbye. To understand Edna, you have to understand the land. Pine Creek sits at just over 8,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies, the kind of elevation where summer is a rumor and winter is a covenant that always keeps itself. The town has one gas station and one diner and one church and a post office open 3 days a week. The mountains surrounding it are the kind that either break a person or forge them into something harder and more permanent than they started as. There is no middle outcome in country like that. The land does not negotiate. It only reveals. Edna's father, Elias Dupree, left Georgia in 1912 with $12 in his pocket and a letter of introduction to a foreman at a rail company in Denver who may or may not have still worked there by the time Elias arrived. He was 17 years old, the son of a sharecropper who had worked another man's land from before sunup to after sundown for the entirety of his life and had nothing permanent to show for it. Elias had decided somewhere between Atlanta and Chattanooga that he was done with arrangements like that. He wanted something that was his, ground that had his name on it and could not be reassigned by someone else's decision or someone else's need or someone else's interpretation of what he deserved. He worked the rails for 7 years. He worked through winters that froze the water in the standpipes and summers that turned the steel rails into things you could not touch with a bare hand. He worked with men who became his brothers in the way that men who share hard labor sometimes become brothers closer than blood, because the bond was built on what they had actually done together rather than on the accident of birth. He saved with a discipline that other men found remarkable, and that Elias found simply necessary, the way breathing was necessary, the way sleep was necessary. He was building towards something specific, and he did not allow himself the luxury of forgetting what it was. In 1919, Elias Dupree paid cash for 47 acres of mountain land outside Pine Creek, Colorado. The parcel had been on the market for 3 years because nobody wanted it. It was steep and cold, and the soil was rocky and thin, and it was a long distance from anywhere that a man needed to be on a regular basis. The price reflected all of this. Elias paid it without hesitation. He built a cabin on that land with 2 other men from the rail crew, men who knew how to make things that stayed put because they had spent years making things that stayed put. They set the foundation on concrete pilings and used lumber that was heavy and true, and built the walls to take the kind of wind that came down off the mountain in January, as though the mountain had a grievance it needed to settle. They built it to last because they understood, all 3 of them, that lasting was the point, that a thing which lasted was a thing which could be handed down, that a thing which could be handed down was proof of something that went beyond the object itself. Edna Rose Dupree was born in that cabin in the winter of 1923. She came into the world in a room her father had built with his own hands on land her father had bought with the wages of his own labor, and that fact shaped everything that came after. She grew up knowing that the ground under her feet had been paid for, not borrowed, not leased, not occupied by permission or by tolerance or by the goodwill of someone who could change their mind. Paid for. In full. With money that had been earned through the kind of work that bends a man's spine and grays his hair before its time, and leaves marks in his hands that never entirely go away. She grew up knowing that what was earned and paid for could not simply be taken away. She grew up believing that. She would spend most of her adult life finding out whether it was true. She married Harold Calloway in the fall of 1951 in the small white church at the edge of Pine Creek on a Saturday afternoon in October, when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and coming cold. Harold was a carpenter from Denver, a quiet man with hands that were large, even by the standards of men who work with their hands, in a way of looking at things as though he was always calculating what they were made of and whether they would hold under pressure. He looked at Edna the same way, with that same careful, evaluating attention. He looked at her and decided she would hold. He was right about that. As it turned out, he was more right than either of them knew at the time. Harold and Edna spent 41 years together in the cabin that Elias had built. They made it larger and stronger over the decades, the way you add to something you fully intend to keep. Not renovating so much as deepening, reinforcing, making permanent what had already been built to last. Harold set the stone fireplace that would heat the place through 40 Colorado winters. He built the porch that faced the mountains and the root cellar that kept them fed through the months when the roads were impassable and the world below the mountain might as well have been a different country. He reinforced the foundation twice. He knew what he was doing with stone and concrete in the way his father had taught him, setting oak beams on pilings, driving steel brackets into the north wall, where the cold came hardest and the pressure from the hillside was most consistent. He did not do this because the foundation needed it yet. He did it because the foundation would need it eventually, because everything needs reinforcement eventually. And he wanted to do the work while he still could do it right. He built the rocking chair last. A white oak had come down in a late-season storm in the fall of 1979, a tree that had stood on the north slope for longer than anyone in Pine Creek could remember. Harold salvaged the best of the wood and spent 3 months working it with a spoke shave and a draw knife, shaping the chair slowly, and with total patience fitting it to Edna's body the way a good tool is fitted to the hand that will use it. He made it so that when she sat in it, she was exactly supported, exactly held, in the precise configuration that her body required. He made it for her and no one else, and when she sat in it for the first time, she understood immediately that this was what he had made and said so. Harold did not respond to this the way a man says, "Thank you for a compliment." He responded to it the way a craftsman responds to a correct assessment of his work. He nodded once. He went back to the kitchen. That was Harold. He died in the autumn of 1992, in his own bed, looking out the window at the mountains he had looked at every morning for 41 years. Edna held his hand. She did not look away. She stayed with him the way he had always stayed with things, fully and without reservation, until there was nothing left to stay for. After Harold, the quiet came. It came the way cold comes into an old house, not suddenly but gradually, finding the gaps and the thin places and settling into them until it felt like it had always been there. Edna was 69 years old when Harold died, and she was not a woman who had ever had much patience for self-pity, her own or anyone else's. But the silence of a house where someone used to be has a weight that is its own particular thing, and she carried it every day. The way you carry something that has no handle and no good way to hold it. She managed the property herself. She caulked the windows and replaced the shingles when they needed replacing, and kept the pipes from freezing through the winters, and chased the coyotes away from the garden with Elias's old 12-gauge that still worked as well as it ever had. She was small and she was getting older, and her hands had begun to tremble slightly when the barometric pressure dropped. But her spine was straight and her eyes were clear, and she knew every inch of the 47 acres the way you only know ground that you have truly fought for. She was not under any circumstances leaving. The letter arrived on a Monday in early December of 1997. It came in a county envelope, cream-colored and official, with the seal of the Pine Creek Municipal Authority printed in the upper left corner. Edna set down her coffee and opened it at the kitchen table, reading it once straight through without expression, and then reading it again. The language was dense with legal terminology and subordinate clauses, but the meaning was straightforward enough once you stripped away the official scaffolding. Douglas Merritt, the mayor of Pine Creek, had determined that the property at 4471 Mountain View Road was structurally unsound and posed an imminent safety hazard to its occupant. A county inspector had assessed the property and identified critical foundation damage consistent with chronic water infiltration. The cabin was condemned. Edna had until the 15th of December to vacate. The 15th was 2 days away. Edna read the letter a third time. She had lived in this cabin for 74 years. She had been born 30 feet from where she was sitting. The foundation that Douglas Merritt's inspector claimed was compromised had been set by her father and reinforced twice by her husband, who had been a mason's son and knew stone the way other men know words or numbers or music. Harold had put his hands on every inch of that foundation. He had known what he was doing, and he had done it right. She knew the sounds this house made in every season and every kind of weather. She knew its settling and its silences and the particular way it absorbed the deep cold of January. She knew there was nothing wrong with it. She also knew why Merritt wanted it. Douglas Merritt had been the mayor of Pine Creek for 11 years. He was a man in his middle 50s who had grown up in Denver and come to Pine Creek after making sufficient money in commercial real estate to want somewhere scenic to spend it. He dressed carefully and spoke smoothly and had a politician's natural talent for making self-interest sound like civic responsibility. He had been talking for 3 years about a luxury development that would bring prosperity to Pine Creek, about what a ski resort would mean for the local economy, about the future of the town and the opportunities it deserved. He said these things with genuine conviction, or something that performed genuine conviction so reliably that the difference had ceased to matter. The development he envisioned required, among other things, the Callaway property. His representative had driven up the mountain 2 months earlier in a rental car, a young man with a rehearsed presentation in a manner designed to seem collegial. He had told Edna about the project, about what the land would become, about what she could receive for it. He had been professional and thorough, and when he was finished, Edna had thanked him for the coffee and told him that her father had worked 19 years on the railroad to buy this land, and that she and her husband had built their lives on it, and that it was not for sale at any figure he could name. She had been perfectly polite about it. She had walked him to his car. She had thought that was the end of it. The condemnation letter told her it was not. She looked at the letter for a long, still moment. Then she picked up the envelope again and turned it upside down. Something else slid out, something she had not noticed initially. A rectangle of heavy paper folded once. She unfolded it. It was a check. Douglas Merritt's signature was at the bottom, written with a fountain pen in dark blue ink. The amount line was blank. The memo line read in the same careful handwriting, "Final offer." Edna understood what this was. It was a last opportunity extended before the machinery moved. He was giving her one more chance to name her price, to put a number in that blank space, to convert her father's sweat and her husband's work and 74 years of her own life into a figure that would make this easier for everyone involved, including herself. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about Elias Dupree standing on this land in 1919 with the deed in his hands and the expression on his face that she had seen in the single photograph that still existed from that day. A man who had arrived at something he had been moving toward for 7 years. A man in possession of proof. She thought about Harold setting the first beam of the foundation with his father's level and his father's knowledge transferred through his own hands. She thought about 41 years of mornings looking at the same mountains from the same porch. Then she stood up, walked to the fireplace Harold had built, and held the check to the flame until the paper caught. She watched it burn down to a black curl of ash in the grate. She went back to the kitchen and finished her coffee. That was not all she did that day. She went to the small desk in the corner of the bedroom, the desk where Harold had kept his carpentry invoices, and she had kept the household accounts for 40 years. She sat down and opened the drawer and took out a legal pad and a pen. For the next 2 hours, she wrote in the careful, precise hand she had developed during the year she spent teaching reading at Pine Creek Elementary, before the school board had decided they no longer required her services. A decision she had understood for exactly what it was and had gone home and never mentioned again. She wrote about Douglas Merritt. She wrote about the young man who had come to her door and what he had said and what she had told him. She wrote about the condemnation order and the inspector who had been on the property for 5 minutes and had not gone into the cellar and had not knocked on a single joist. She wrote about everything she knew of Merritt's development plans, the conversation she had overheard at the diner across 3 years, the things Mavis Aldrich had told her about what was being discussed at the county utility meetings, the things that Pete Garner at the gas station had mentioned about the survey crews who had come through in the spring. She organized it carefully. She cross-referenced the dates. She attached copies of the documents she had been keeping because Edna Rose Calloway had been keeping copies of things since 1952 and had never thrown away a piece of paper that might one day be relevant. She put everything into a large envelope. She addressed it to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Denver field office. She walked down to the mailbox at the end of the service road in the cold December afternoon and put the envelope in with the flag raised. Then she walked back to the cabin and sat in Harold's rocking chair and listened to the wind beginning to build in the pines and thought quietly and without drama that she had done what she could do. The rest was not in her hands. She had put it where it needed to go. Now she would wait and see what came of it. What came 3 days later was the blizzard. The storm arrived the way a door gets kicked in, sudden, total, and with no room for discussion. By noon, the sky had turned the color of a deep bruise moving from the northwest with a speed that left no time for gradual adjustment. By 2 in the afternoon, the snow was coming sideways, driven by a wind that moved through the pine trees with a sound like sustained tearing, shaking the walls of the cabin in rhythmic, heavy pulses, like something large pressing against the outside to find a way in. The power went at 9 o'clock that evening. Edna had expected it. She lit the kerosene lanterns and added wood to the fire and settled into Harold's rocking chair with a cup of tea that was already going cold. The radio was dead. The telephone line hummed with static when she picked it up and put it down again. The fire moved light across the log walls in patterns she had watched for 70 years, the same shadows in the same positions, as familiar as the lines of her own face. She was not a woman who was afraid of being alone. She had been alone for 5 years and had made her terms with it, the particular accommodation a person makes when the alternative is not available. But tonight the solitude had a different quality. There was a density to the silence underneath the storm, a weight to the darkness outside the windows that she did not entirely like, as though the night were closer than it normally was, as though it had come in from the edge and was pressing. She was pulling her shawl tighter when she heard it. It did not belong to the storm. The storm had its own vocabulary, a language she knew well after 74 years on this mountain. The sustained howl of the wind, the crack of ice-loaded branches giving way, the particular percussion of heavy snow against glass. What she heard now was underneath all of that, a low mechanical sound that was resolving as she listened into something she recognized with a start. Engines. More than one. The sound built slowly and then more quickly, and she knew before she could see anything what it was. Motorcycles. She set down the tea and went to the window and cleared a circle in the frost with the heel of her palm. The moonlight was breaking through the cloud cover in fitful intervals, and in one of those intervals, she saw them. 9 motorcycles on the service road that ran along the lower edge of her property, the road that no sensible person would have been on in any weather, and certainly not in this one. She watched the lead bike hit a patch of ice. It went sideways without warning, the rear wheel spinning out, and the whole machine going over with the kind of inevitability that ice and physics always produce together. The rider went down hard, and the bike came down on top of him, and the sound of it was audible even through the walls of the cabin, and the roar of the storm, a heavy metallic crash followed by something that might have been a shout. The remaining 8 bikes skidded to ragged stops, engines cutting out one after another, riders coming off quickly and moving toward the downed machine and the man beneath it. Edna watched them work the snow waist-deep and rising the wind, hitting them broadside in heavy, sustained gusts. And what she noticed first was not the size of them, or the leather they were wearing, or the patches on their backs. What she noticed first was that not one of them was looking back toward the road in the direction they had come from. Not one of them was calculating their exit. They were working on the machine, and they were crouched over the man on the ground, and they were not going anywhere. Not one of them was going anywhere without all of them. And that was evident in the way they moved, and the way they were positioned, and the way their attention was entirely on the man in the snow and not on any version of their own safety or convenience. Edna looked at this for a moment. Then she looked at the 12-gauge that hung above the mantel, the one that had belonged to Elias, still sound, still loaded the way it always was. Then she looked back at the window at 9 men being swallowed by a Colorado blizzard on her service road. She heard Harold's voice in the particular way she sometimes heard it. Still not like a ghost, not like something supernatural, but like a memory so clear it had presence. Clear as if he were standing just behind the rocking chair, which was where he used to stand sometimes when she was sitting in it, and he wanted to say something without making a production of saying it. "You don't leave a person out in this, Edna," he said. "Not in this cold. Not in any cold." She stood up, she put on her wool coat and her rubber-soled boots, and she picked up the kerosene lantern from the table and she went to the front door and opened it. The wind hit her like a wall. She was 74 years old and 5 feet 2 inches tall, and the cold went through her immediately, finding the gaps between her layers, finding the places where her age had thinned, the insulation her body could provide. For a moment she stood at the top of the porch steps and felt the full weight of what she was doing, and the full weight of what the night was, the darkness and the cold and the snow that was now well past her knees at the base of the steps. Then she held the lantern up over her head and walked down into it. The 50 yards to the service road took longer than 50 yards had any right to take. She could not see the men until she was nearly on top of them, the storm reducing visibility to almost nothing. And then they materialized out of the white wall of the weather suddenly and all at once, massive shapes in dark leather. And the nearest one turned at the sound she made when she called out over the wind. She saw him clearly for a moment in the lantern light. He was enormous, well over 6 feet, built in a way that suggested the size was structural rather than incidental. The frame of a man designed for a particular kind of work and shaped by years of doing it. He had pale eyes above a bandana pulled up against the cold, and even buried in snow and clearly exhausted, he had the physical presence of something that took up space as a matter of course and had never once apologized for it. He shouted at her to get back inside. She told him the roads were gone a mile back, washed out by the runoff from the storm's leading edge. She told him the bridge over Miller Creek was sheeted in ice and impassable. She told him that if they stayed on this road through the night, They would be frozen by morning, all 9 of them. And she said this at the full volume of a voice that had spent decades carrying across mountain distances, 74 years old, in rubber boots and a wool coat, not moving an inch. The big man looked at the rider on the ground. He was conscious now, but clearly hurt, one hand gripping his ankle, his face tight with the specific expression of someone managing pain through will, because the alternative is not acceptable. The big man looked at the bikes buried to their fenders in the drifts. He looked back at the old woman with the lantern standing in the middle of the blizzard, as though she had every right to be there, which she did, because it was her road. "We got nowhere to go," he said. His voice carried even through the wind. "I got a fire," Edna said, "and I got a barn for the bikes. Get 'em up." The big man looked at her for a long moment, those pale eyes steady above the bandana. Then he turned to his men and said something quietly and without drama, and the group began to move with a readiness that suggested the decision had been reached, and there was nothing further to deliberate. His name, she would learn over the course of the long night ahead, was Gideon Cross. They called him Ironclad, and she would come to understand that the name referred less to his physical toughness, which was considerable, than to a quality of his character, a quality of settled resolve, of commitments made that stayed made. But in that moment in the snow, he was simply the large man who had looked at her with those pale eyes, and then turned to his men and said quietly and without ceremony the words that set everything in motion. "Let's go." It took 20 minutes to get 9 motorcycles into Harold's old hay barn, the men working with a precision that Edna found genuinely surprising to watch. They moved as a unit, each person anticipating what the others needed, the work distributed without discussion or assignment. The injured rider stayed at the center of the group, throughout 2 men supporting him continuously, while the others pushed the machines through the snow. The bikes went in one by one, arranged efficiently in the space available, and when the last one was in and the barn doors were pulled shut against the wind, the quiet inside was sudden and almost physical. They came up onto the porch in a line, and the boards shook under their combined weight in a way the boards had not shaken since Harold was alive and had his crew up to work on the roof one October afternoon years ago. Edna held the door, and they filed through one after another, 9 men in dark leather, with patches on their backs and ice in their beards, and a collective physical mass that compressed the air in the room when they entered. The patches read Iron Sons. Edna had heard the name. Most people in the Mountain States had heard it. She looked at the patches, and then she looked at the men wearing them, standing in her living room, dripping snowmelt onto the braided rug that had been there since 1961. And she made the same assessment she had been making of people her entire life, quickly and directly reading what was there, rather than what she expected to find. She pointed at the boots. "Off," she said. "I just waxed those floors." There was a brief pause that contained a great deal. Then one by one, without argument, all 9 of them sat down on whatever was available and took their boots off. 9 men who had names that carried weight in certain circles, who had been feared and respected and misunderstood in roughly equal measure across 5 states, sitting on her floor in their socks because a 74-year-old woman had told them to. Edna looked at them. "You?" she said, pointing at the largest one, a man with a shaved head and hands the size of plates, nearly as tall as Gideon and broader in the shoulders. "What's your name?" "Amos," he said. "They call me Cornerstone." "Amos, there's a woodpile behind the barn. Bring enough for the night." Amos went back out into the cold without a word of hesitation. She pointed at another one, a man with a reddish beard who was watching her with an expression somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of something that might have been respect. "You," she said. "What's your name?" "Fletcher," he said. "They call me Cragg. Fletcher Boone, ma'am." "Fletcher, come peel these potatoes." Fletcher looked at the potato peeler she was holding out to him. He looked at his hands, which were large and decorated with ink up to the wrists. He looked at Gideon with the expression of a man who has encountered something that does not fit any category he is prepared for. Gideon was working very hard not to smile. Fletcher took the potato peeler. The youngest one, the one with the injured ankle, Callum Hess, she sat on the sofa and elevated his foot on 2 stacked pillows and told him to stop trying to walk on it because she could see what he was doing and it was not helping anything. She worked his ankle carefully with her fingers, assessing despite the arthritis that had been making itself known in her joints for the past 3 winters, and told him it was a bad sprain and not a break, which was the better news of the two available options. "We don't carry medical supplies," Gideon said from across the room, watching her work. "I didn't ask what you had," Edna said already on her way to the kitchen. She made a compress from a dish towel and a bag of frozen peas from the bottom of the freezer and wrapped the ankle firmly and told Callum to keep it elevated and not to be foolish about it, which she could see he was considering. Then she put the beef stew on the stove, the one she had made 2 days earlier that was sitting in the refrigerator, and she put cornbread in the oven, and she ran her household the way she had run it for 50 years, which was to say with competence and without asking anyone's permission or apologizing for the manner of the doing. By the time the stew was hot and the cornbread was out of the oven, the room had changed in quality. The 9 men had spread around the space, some on the floor with their backs against the wall, some near Callum on the sofa, 2 standing close to the fire that Amos had stacked high with fresh wood when he came back from the woodpile, with his arms fully loaded and his expression suggesting he had found the work satisfactory. The tension had not disappeared so much as transformed, shifting from the wariness of strangers in an unfamiliar space to something that had more warmth in it, something closer to the way men settle when they are fed and dry, and the immediate danger has been replaced by the knowledge that they will get through the night. They used the napkins she put out without being asked. They said please when they wanted more cornbread and said thank you when she brought it. Callum said ma'am to her twice without being prompted, which Harold would have approved of without making a point of it. It was during the second bowl of stew that Gideon found the letter. He had noticed the stack of papers on the side table when he first came in, the way he noticed most things in a room, quietly and without making his attention obvious. The county seal on the envelope on top, the red stamp, the kind of official mail that a person with his history recognized for what it was before they opened it. He had also noticed, in the way he had been noticing things for decades as a matter of practice, the empty rectangle on the wall where something had clearly hung for a long time, the bare space on the bookshelf where an object had stood until recently, the small signs of a household that had been carrying weight for longer than it wanted to show. "You live here alone," he said. "Since my Harold passed," Edna said. 5 years now." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. Then he said without preamble, "Who's trying to take it?" Edna looked at him. She had spent 74 years reading people quickly and had very rarely been wrong about what she found. She looked at Gideon Cross and she took his measure in the straightforward way she took the measure of most things, without ceremony and without the usual social performances that preceded honest assessment. And then she reached over and picked up the condemnation order from the side table and handed it to him. He read it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He passed it to Fletcher, who read it and made a low sound in his chest. "They're calling it a safety violation," Fletcher said. "Structural hazard." "Is it?" Gideon asked her. Edna looked at him with an expression that could have etched glass. "Harold built this foundation," she said. "His father was a mason. He knew stone the way some men know words or numbers. He put his hands on every inch of what's under this house, and he did it right. The inspector they sent was here for 5 minutes. He didn't go into the cellar. He didn't put his hands on a single joist." She paused. "He wrote what he was told to write." Gideon looked at the date on the letter. His expression did not change, but something in the quality of his attention sharpened slightly. "This says vacate by the 15th, he said. Edna looked at the calendar on the wall above the kitchen door. "That's tomorrow," she said. The word came out flat and factual, the way she said most things of significance, without theatrical weight letting the fact carry what it carried on its own. Gideon stood up. He was very still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man in the process of making a decision that has consequences he is willing to accept. "This Merritt," he said. "Is he a brave man?" Edna made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Douglas Merritt," she said, "is a coward in a 3-piece suit. He has never done a difficult thing in his life when he could hire someone else to do it for him. His nephew is the sheriff." Gideon nodded slowly. He looked down at the letter. "And you're here alone," he said. I'm always here alone, Edna said. She stood because she was tired in the sudden and total way that came for her now, without warning the way a door sometimes closes before you expect it. She picked up the empty bowls from the table. That's not your problem, she said. You boys get some sleep. Storm should break by noon. You can be on your way. She went to her bedroom and closed the door. In the living room, the fire burned and the wind pressed against the windows, and 9 men sat in their socks in a 74-year-old woman's house and said nothing for a while. Gideon stood looking at the closed door with the condemnation letter still in his hand and the date on it that was now less than 3 hours from becoming today. He looked at the calendar on the wall. He looked at the empty rectangle where the photograph had hung. He thought about a house in Denver, a small house on a street he had stood on when he was 26 years old and watched a moving truck carry away everything his mother had accumulated through 30 years of work at the school district because a development company had run a condemnation through the city council and every piece of paper had been in order and he had had nothing and known nothing and been able to do nothing at all. He had stood on that sidewalk with his hands empty and his anger enormous and useless, and he had understood in that moment what it meant to have nothing to put against a machine that had already made its decision. He had been carrying that understanding ever since. He had been carrying it for 20 years, and he had never found a place to set it down. He looked at his men. Fletcher was watching him steadily across the room. Amos had come in from the last woodpile run and was watching him. Callum on the sofa with his ankle elevated, his young face serious in the firelight. "We're not going to Utah," Gideon said quietly. "Not yet." Nobody argued. Nobody had expected to. Amos put another log on the fire. Fletcher found a spot near the wall and made himself comfortable with the ease of a man accustomed to sleeping in worse places. One by one, the iron suns settled into the spaces of Edna Rose Calloway's living room, quiet and deliberate, and the storm pressed against the windows and the fire held, and the night moved toward morning with the slow purpose of a night that knows something is going to happen when the light comes back. Just before 2 o'clock, Fletcher was near the front window when he saw the headlights at the far end of the service road. 2 of them sitting still in the darkness at the edge of where the road curved into the pines. Not moving, just present, watching the cabin with its lit windows and the vehicles visible through the gap in the barn doors. Fletcher watched the lights for a long time. Then they went out. He did not wake Edna. He went back to his position near the wall and lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought about what a man who had already arranged a demolition crew needed to see in the middle of a blizzard that could not wait until morning. He thought about what the patience of those lights told you about the man behind them and about the morning that was being planned. A man who was still deciding took his time watching. A man who had finished deciding sent someone to confirm what he already knew. Fletcher understood which kind of watching that had been. He put another log on the fire and returned to his position without waking anyone. The storm continued its slow retreat outside the wind, dropping by degrees, the snow settling into the stillness that comes after a storm has said what it came to say. The fire burned low and was built back up. Edna Rose Calloway slept in the bedroom her father had built in the bed that Harold had made on the land that Elias Dupree had purchased with the wages of 19 years on the railroad, because he wanted something that was genuinely and permanently his. She did not yet know everything that the next day was going to require of her. But she had burned the check in the grate, and she had opened the door into the blizzard, and she had mailed the envelope to Denver, and she had taken the measure of 9 strangers and found them in the ways that mattered most, not so different from the men she had known and trusted all her life. Men who stayed, the kind her father had been, the kind Harold had been, the kind she was about to find out in the full light of the morning that was coming. These were 2. The smell reached her before anything else did. Edna Rose Calloway had been waking up in the same bedroom for 74 years, and she knew every smell this cabin made in every season and every kind of weather. She knew the smell of wood smoke and cold pine and the particular dry warmth of a fire that had been burning through the night and was settling into its long morning rhythm. She knew the smell of coffee, the way it moved through the house in the mornings, reaching every room before she did. This was different. This was bacon and something sweeter underneath it, butter and something fruited and warm. the specific smell of batter on a hot cast iron griddle that she had not encountered in this kitchen since Harold was alive. Because Harold had been the one who made pancakes on Sunday mornings, standing at the stove in his undershirt, with his enormous carpenter's hands working the spatula with an improbable delicacy that came from 40 years of practice, flipping them at exactly the right moment with the confidence of a man who had done a thing enough times to trust himself completely. Edna put on her glasses and her robe and opened the bedroom door. She stopped in the doorway. Amos Bridwell was standing at her stove. He was wearing Harold's apron, the one that said King of the Grill in letters that had faded to near illegibility over 20 years of use, the one that had been hanging on its hook by the icebox since the autumn of 1992, because Edna had never had the heart to move it and never had a reason to use it. Amos was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 260 pounds, and he was wearing that apron and turning pancakes on her cast iron griddle with an attention and care that was genuinely startling to witness. The muscles in his forearms, extensively marked with ink that told stories she did not yet know, shifted and moved with each careful turn of the spatula. "Morning, Miss Edna," he said without turning around. "Coffee's ready. Sit down." Edna sat down. She looked around the room. The living room was immaculate. The braided rug had been straightened. The sofa cushions were back in their proper positions. The bowls and cups from the previous evening had been washed and were stacked in the drying rack. The fire was burning high and steady with fresh wood, and the wood box beside the fireplace had been filled to the top. The floor was clean. The side table had been tidied. Everything that 9 large men had disturbed in the course of inhabiting her space for an evening had been returned to its exact original position. The other men were gone from the room. The cold thought came before she could stop it, sudden and clarifying the thought arriving fully assembled. She pushed back from the table and went to the front window. What she saw stopped the thought entirely. Gideon Cross was on her roof. He was up there with Fletcher, both of them working with the snow shovels from the barn, clearing the massive drift that had built against the north chimney and across the section of roof above the porch, overhang where the snow load was deepest and most dangerous. They moved with methodical efficiency, shoveling in long strokes from the peak downward, not hurrying but not wasting a single motion either. 2 other men were at the barn. One was replacing the hinge on the main door, the hinge that had been pulling away from the frame since the spring of 1994, when a late-season wind had caught the door at the wrong angle. The other was examining something on the exterior wall with a flashlight, moving it slowly across the old timber with the focused attention of someone conducting a real assessment rather than a cursory one. And underneath the cabin, visible as a moving beam of light through the crawlspace vent on the eastern side, someone was working their way along the foundation in the cold dark. Edna stood at the window for a long moment and watched these men working on the home that her father had built and that she and Harold had kept for 50 years. Watched them doing it with a thoroughness that no hired hand she had ever paid had brought to any job on this property. Watched the steam rising from their breath in the cold morning air, steady and purposeful. She went back to the table and sat down. "Boss said if they claim the house is unsound, we make it sound," Amos said, sliding a plate in front of her without being asked. Stack of 3 blueberries butter on the side. He went back to the stove. "My grandmother's recipe. She taught me when I was 7 years old. Said you could tell the measure of a man by whether he paid attention to the small things or only to the large ones." He put the butter dish on the table and did not say anything further. Edna looked at the pancakes. She looked at Amos. Then she picked up her fork. They were, she would later acknowledge, to the empty air in the general direction of wherever Harold currently resided, exceptional. Gideon came in 20 minutes later, stomping snow from his boots on the porch, before entering the way he had been taught to enter a house, or had taught himself the distinction unclear and unimportant. He was flushed from the exertion steam rising from his thermal shirt, and he poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at Edna with the directness she had come to recognize in him, a man who looked at difficult things without flinching from what he found. "Foundation is solid," he said. Harold knew exactly what he was doing. Oak beams on concrete pilings, steel brackets on the north wall. This structure is built better than most permitted construction I've seen in the last decade. He set the mug down on the counter. But somebody has been under there. Edna set her fork down carefully. What do you mean? Gideon looked at her steadily. I mean, somebody cut your north drainage pipe. Clean cut. Not a crack or a fracture from age or pressure. A cut. And somebody pulled the gravel away from the base of the east footing, which produces exactly the kind of water infiltration pattern that looks on a quick inspection like chronic foundation damage. Edna was quiet. The morning light was coming off the snow outside the window with a brilliance that made everything sharp and clear and slightly merciless in the way winter light sometimes is revealing things that other seasons allow to remain softened. They made it look broken, she said. Gideon nodded. Whoever signed that inspection report either believed what he saw or was told what to write. Either way, the conditions he described were created deliberately before he arrived. The damage was installed. Edna absorbed this. She thought about the envelope she had mailed to Denver 4 days ago. She thought about the check burning in the grate. And then before Gideon could say anything further, she made the decision herself. Suahedi, she said. Then she stopped and corrected herself the way a woman who has been thinking in English, in Spanish, and the private language of her own memory sometimes shifts without noticing. Fix all of it, she said. Right now. If another inspector walks through here today, they should not find a single thing to write down. Gideon looked at her. Already done, he said. Fletcher ran the drainage pipe this morning before breakfast. We repacked the footing gravel and shored the disturbed area. Edna looked at him for a moment. Then the question she asked was the same one she had asked the previous night, and she meant the same thing by it. Why, she said. Gideon picked up his coffee. He held it for a moment before answering. Because you fed us, he said, and because you opened that door in a blizzard when you had no reason to, and every reason not to. In our world, that means something that doesn't have a good word for it, but doesn't need one. It was not the whole answer, and they both understood that. But it was the answer he gave, and Edna accepted it because she had learned over the course of a long life that men sometimes keep their deepest reasons in places they do not open for strangers, and that the reasons themselves matter less than the actions that come from them. Harold had been that way. You learned over time to read what a man did rather than wait for him to explain it. She had just picked up her fork again when the lights went out. Not gradually. All at once, the way power fails when it is cut deliberately rather than lost to weather. The hum of the refrigerator ceased, and the electric light above the table went dark simultaneously, and the cabin was running on firelight, and the flat gray winter light coming through the windows. Gideon straightened. Fletcher, he said without raising his voice. Fletcher appeared from somewhere in the back of the house, already moving toward the utility panel, with the ease of someone who had anticipated the instruction before it was given. Kill the main breaker before it tries to reset, Gideon said. Fletcher went. Gideon looked at Edna. Does Merritt have influence over the utility board? He appointed 3 of the 5 members himself, Edna said. The other 2 do what they're told. Gideon nodded once. He reached into the interior pocket of his vest and produced a satellite phone, the kind that belonged in a military surplus catalog, heavy and utilitarian and entirely indifferent to weather conditions or the absence of cell towers. He looked at Edna. I need to make a call, he said. There's a man in Chicago. He's owed me a favor for 4 years. I think today is when I collect it. Who is he? Edna asked. His name is Augustus Croft, Gideon said. They call him the Ledger. Edna raised an eyebrow. He's a lawyer, Gideon said. The best I've ever watched work. He hasn't lost a case involving real property fraud in over a decade. Edna was quiet for a moment. You think this is fraud, she said. Gideon looked at her directly. I think a dead man's signature on a government property document is generally what fraud looks like, yes. The room went still. Edna set her fork down a second time. She looked at the fireplace. Then she looked back at Gideon with the expression of a woman who has just been given a piece of information that confirms something she already half knew and is rapidly reconstructing her understanding of the full shape of what she is dealing with. He used a dead man's name, she said. I noticed the inspector's name on that letter last night, Gideon said. Raymond Holt. I know that name from the construction trade. I made a call at 2 this morning to someone who would know. He paused. Holt died 14 months ago. Cardiac event November of last year. Edna looked at the fireplace for a long moment. The fire Harold had built was doing what it had always done, holding against the cold, the way it was designed to hold the stone, absorbing the heat and radiating it steadily and without complaint. She thought about the envelope in Denver. She thought about what it contained and who had it now and what it meant that Merritt had gone this far. A man who forges the signature of a dead man on a federal document has already decided that the rules do not apply to him. A man who has decided that needs to be shown otherwise by someone with the authority to do the showing. Make your call, she said. Gideon went to the window and dialed. Within the hour, 2 industrial generators had been brought in from the equipment trailer. One of the support vehicles had been towing and positioned outside the cabin. Callum Hess, his ankle wrapped firmly, and his limp something he was managing through sheer determination not to show, directed the setup from the porch with the focused efficiency of someone who had done similar work in less comfortable conditions and was applying everything that experience had taught him. By mid-morning, the cabin had power again, more reliable than what the utility board-controlled space heaters running alongside the baseboards. The refrigerator humming again, the lights steady. Better off than when we started, Fletcher said, surveying the setup with professional satisfaction. That was the idea, Gideon said, coming back inside from the porch, where he had been for nearly an hour, pacing its length in the cold, talking with the focused intensity of a man who was not asking for assistance so much as directing resources toward a specific objective. Croft is coming, he said. He'll be here by dark. Edna looked at him. He was already working on this, Gideon said. Merritt's name had come up in something Croft had been watching for some time. He said this morning's call saved him the trouble of making one himself. That was all Gideon said about it. Edna was beginning to understand that Gideon Cross operated on a strict economy of information, sharing what was needed and keeping the rest in reserve, and that this was not evasion but discipline, the habit of a man who had learned that precision mattered more than completeness in most situations. She found she did not mind this. Harold had been somewhat similar. It was a quality she associated with men who had accepted genuine responsibility for other people and had taken that responsibility seriously enough to be careful with it. The afternoon settled into a waiting that had texture to it, dense and purposeful. The men finished their work on the exterior and came back inside. They cleaned themselves up as thoroughly as circumstances allowed, and they reassumed their positions around the living room with the ease of people who had established a familiarity with the space in a short time. But the quality of their stillness was different from the previous evening. The night before, they had been exhausted men finding warmth. Now they were something else. Their leather cuts were back on. Their patches were straight. They moved with the quiet deliberateness of men who had assessed what was coming and had made their individual and collective peace with it. Edna sat in Harold's rocking chair and watched them. She had Elias's 12-gauge across her lap, loaded the way it always was. Fletcher had noticed when she picked it up and glanced at Gideon. Gideon had given a small nod. She knows how to use it. Edna had not asked him how he knew that. He had known it the same way he knew most things, by looking carefully at what was in front of him and trusting what he saw. The afternoon light moved across the log walls, and the fire kept its steady pace. And outside, the storm was fully gone, the sky clearing to the specific hard blue that comes after a mountain blizzard, everything washed clean and sharp-edged. The snow on the ground was deep and brilliant and undisturbed except where the men had worked, and the mountains behind it all were clear and enormous and entirely themselves. Edna looked at the men arranged in her living room. She thought with a clarity that sometimes came to her in moments of genuine consequence that whatever came up that road today, it was not coming to find a woman alone. Augustus Croft arrived at 5 o'clock. Edna heard the car before she saw it, the sound of tire chains on packed snow, deliberate and measured. The vehicle was a silver German sedan, expensive and well-maintained, and it navigated the ruts left by the previous day's activity with the careful attention of a man who had not been here before and was not going to be stopped by that fact. The man who got out looked entirely wrong for the mountains. He was somewhere in his early 60s, slight with silver-streaked hair, cut close and wire-rimmed glasses that had clearly not been inexpensive. He wore a charcoal cashmere overcoat and leather gloves and carried a briefcase that he held with the deliberate care of something that contained things worth being careful with. He made his way across the snow to the porch in leather-soled shoes, placing each step with the focused attention of a man who did not own snow boots and was not going to let that be relevant. Gideon met him at the door. "Gus," he said. Ironclad Croft said, looking Gideon over with the evaluating calm of a man accustomed to assessing situations quickly. "You look terrible." "I've been on a roof," Gideon said. Croft came inside. He stopped. He looked around the room at the iron suns in their various positions. He looked at Callum on the sofa with his ankle elevated. He looked at the fire and the lanterns and the generators humming outside, and the comprehensive evidence of 9 large men having occupied a small mountain cabin for the better part of a day and a half. Then he looked at Edna in the rocking chair with the 12-gauge across her lap. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, removing his gloves and inclining his head with a courtesy that was entirely genuine and entirely unhurried. "Augustus Croft, Ironclad tells me you're having a problem with a pest." "You could call it that," Edna said. "Coffee's on the stove. Black 2 sugars. Sit down." Croft blinked. He looked at Gideon. Gideon said nothing. Croft went to the stove and poured his own coffee and came back and sat down at the kitchen table and opened his briefcase. What came out of that briefcase was the product of a full day's intensive work by a man who had spent 4 decades knowing exactly which public records to pull and how to read what they contained. He spread a topographic survey across the table, weighting the corners with coffee cups and the salt shaker from the counter, and he pointed to a line marked in blue. It ran directly beneath the Calloway property, entering from the north and passing through the land at a depth of approximately 200 feet before continuing south toward the valley floor. "That is the primary channel of the Piedmont Aquifer," Croft said. "A deep water formation surveyed in 1988 and again in 1993. The second survey, conducted by the State Geological Office and a matter of complete public record, estimated accessible yield at approximately 40 million gallons per year for a minimum of 50 years. Edna looked at the map. She looked at the blue line running beneath the meadow where she had walked every morning for more years than she could readily calculate. "That's my well," she said. "Harold dug it in 1958. Your well accesses the upper edge of the formation," Croft said. "The primary channel runs under the northern third of your property, under the meadow, under the pine grove on the north slope." "What does that mean exactly?" Fletcher said from across the room. He had moved forward without anyone noticing, and he was looking at the map with the attention of someone who had learned that the important things were usually in the details that other people skim past. "It means," Croft said, "that 18 months ago, a California-based water development company called Pacific Crest Water Corporation filed a preliminary acquisition inquiry with the Colorado Water Rights Board." He produced a document from the stack. "They are seeking to purchase extraction rights to the Piedmont Aquifer for commercial bottling operations at industrial scale." He looked directly at Edna. "The extraction rights alone are currently valued at approximately $40 million. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when a number of that size is placed into a space where nobody was expecting it. Not silence exactly, but a suspension, everyone in the room recalibrating simultaneously. Edna sat with it. She looked at the blue line under her meadow, under the stand of pines, where Harold had built a bench in 1975, so she could sit on Sunday mornings and watch the mountains come into their light. She thought about Elias Dupree standing on this land with the deed in his hands. She thought about what 19 years of railroad work looked like when it was converted into something permanent. She thought about what $40 million looked like to a man like Douglas Merritt, who had spent his career understanding exactly what things were worth and moving toward the ones worth the most. "He was never going to build a resort," she said. "It was not a question." "No," Croft said. "He was never going to build a resort. He just needed my name off the deed." Croft confirmed it with a nod. Condemned property seized through remediation proceedings costs a fraction of fair market value. He clears the title through the county transfers, the water rights to Pacific Crest, collects his payment, and the arrangement disappears into a structure clean enough that nothing leads back to him directly. Edna looked at the fire. The fire Harold had built in the fireplace Harold had laid in the house that Elias had raised on land he had earned with his own hands. She was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. He needed the land worthless on paper, she said. So he made it worthless on paper. There is one additional matter, Croft said. He hesitated, which Edna would later understand was unusual for him. He produced another document and laid it beside the map. The inspection report that generated the condemnation order bears the signature of a licensed structural inspector named Raymond Holt. Mr. Holt held a valid Colorado inspector's certification for 19 years. His professional record was clean. Gideon looked up. He said. Croft placed a second document beside the first. Raymond Holt died 14 months ago. Cardiac event, Denver, November of last year. I have the death certificate. He set it down so that both signatures were visible simultaneously. Same hand, Fletcher said immediately. He had come further forward without anyone marking the movement, and he was looking at the two documents with the focused attention of a man who had some personal familiarity with the practice of comparing signatures. Same person wrote both of those, confirmed, Croft said. Someone forged the signature of a dead man on a federal property inspection document to manufacture a legal basis for the seizure of a widow's home. That is not a civil matter. That is a federal felony. Amos let out a long, slow breath from near the door. Callum from the sofa said quietly, "How arrogant do you have to be to do something like that?" That's exactly the word Gideon said. Arrogant. He made a calculation about who was watching and decided nobody was because he decided she was alone. He miscalculated, Croft said simply. Then he reached into the briefcase again. There is more. He produced a third document, thinner, stapled at the corner. Sheriff Boyd Merritt, he said, is Douglas Merritt's nephew by marriage, which is documented and known to most people in Pine Creek. What is considerably less known is that Boyd Merritt's name appears on the incorporation documents of a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The company is called Mountain Ridge Holdings. He set the document on the table. Mountain Ridge Holdings received a wire transfer of $240,000 from a subsidiary of Pacific Crest Water Corporation 8 months ago. The room absorbed this. He's not just the nephew, Gideon said. He is a 15% equity partner, Croft said, in the proceeds of whatever Douglas Merritt collects from Pacific Crest. Sheriff Boyd Merritt has a direct and substantial financial interest in the seizure of this specific property. Every time he comes to this door to enforce that condemnation order, he is not enforcing the law. He is protecting his own investment. Edna had not moved during any of this. She sat in Harold's rocking chair with Elias's 12-gauge across her lap, and she listened to Augustus Croft methodically dismantle the apparatus of what had been built against her document. By document, the architecture of the thing becoming visible as each piece was laid down, the way a structure becomes visible when you strip away the surface and look at what is actually holding it up. She felt something moving through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief and not quite the particular cold satisfaction of being proven right about something you wished you had been wrong about. It was all three of those things in proportions that kept shifting as she listened. That dirty, low, greedy snake, she said. Her voice was entirely level when she said it, which made it more than if she had shouted. The room was made quieter by it. Edna, Gideon said. She looked at him. He was watching her steadily. They will come tomorrow. Today they tried to freeze you out. Tomorrow they come with the order and the equipment, and they will want it fast before anyone can mount a proper legal response. The plan will be to move quickly and make it a fact on the ground before there is time to challenge it. I know, Edna said. We need to be ready for what that looks like. I have been ready, she said, since before you got here. There is something else, Croft said. He looked at Gideon, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Croft looked back at Edna. The FBI field office in Denver has been aware of Pacific Crest Water Corporation's acquisition activities in the mountain counties for approximately 18 months. There have been irregularities in several other counties, a pattern of condemned properties disputed inspections, title transfers that move more quickly than they should have. Nothing has risen to a prosecutable case because the paper trails have been managed carefully and the affected property owners have in each case been pressured or persuaded into settlement before the matter reached a stage where federal intervention was warranted. He paused. I tell you this because I want you to understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. This is not an isolated instance of local corruption. This is part of a coordinated pattern, and the moment we introduce these documents into a public proceeding, this becomes considerably larger than a Pine Creek property dispute. He looked at her directly. Are you prepared for that, Mrs. Calloway? Edna Rose Calloway looked at Augustus Croft with the expression of a woman who has been asked a question she settled for herself long before the conversation began. My father worked 19 years on the railroad to buy this land, she said. My husband spent 41 years making it into a home. I have lived on it for 74 years, and I have kept it, and I have fought for it every way I knew how to fight. She put her hands on the arms of the rocking chair, the chair shaped to fit her, exactly made for her and no one else, by the hands of a man who had known her better than she had sometimes known herself. Whatever it takes, she said. That was all. Croft looked at her for a moment with an expression that was as close to open admiration as a man of his discipline and practice ever allowed himself to show. Then he opened the briefcase again and began to organize the documents in the specific sequence of a man constructing an argument that was going to be very difficult to dismantle by anyone who came at it honestly. They worked through the evening. Croft laid out the strategy, and Gideon and Edna both listened and both asked questions. Edna's questions, sharp and specific, focused on the gaps, the places where the argument could be attacked. Croft answered everything with the precision of a man who had already thought 10 steps past every question before it arrived. The other men came and went, keeping the fire, moving at intervals around the perimeter of the property in a rotation that Edna noticed and did not comment on. Amos made a large pot of chili from what he found in the pantry, and everyone ate it standing or sitting wherever they were because the table was covered in documents and there was no point in clearing it. Just before 10 o'clock, with the strategy established and the calls made and everything organized in the sequence it would be needed, Gideon sat down in the chair across from Edna. Harold's reading chair, the one beside the lamp where Harold had spent his evenings with whatever he was reading, moving through books slowly and with total attention the way he did most things. Gideon sat in it the way you sit in a chair when you are tired, in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. When the tiredness is the kind that comes from carrying something significant for a sustained period of time. Edna looked at him sitting in Harold's chair and felt something she had not been prepared for. Not grief exactly, but the outline of it, the particular shape of the space a person leaves that can be made suddenly visible by someone else occupying the same physical position without knowing what they are doing. You have children? Gideon asked. No, Edna said. We tried. It wasn't meant to be. Gideon nodded. He looked at the fire for a moment. Harold sounds like he was a good man, he said. He was the best man I ever knew, Edna said. She looked at the fire alongside him. He would have liked you. Gideon considered this. Why, he said. You're not afraid of work, Edna said, and you stay when it gets hard. She paused. Harold always said you could judge a man by two things: whether he does what he says he will do, and whether he stays when staying costs something. Gideon was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. My mother, he said, and then he stopped. Edna waited. She had learned over a long life that some things needed space around them before they came out right, that the silence before a difficult thing was part of the thing itself and should not be filled prematurely. She had a house, he said finally, small place in Denver, nothing that anyone would call impressive. But she had worked 30 years at the school district to pay for it, and it was hers, and she knew what that meant. When I was 26, a development company decided they needed her block, and they ran a condemnation through the city council. He looked at his hands. Every piece of paper was in order. Everything they did was technically legal. I couldn't stop it. I didn't know what I know now. I didn't have Croft. I didn't have anything except anger and no idea what to do with it. He looked up. That was 20 years ago. I have been carrying it ever since. Edna looked at him for a long moment. Well, she said, now you found a place to put it down. Gideon almost smiled. The closest thing to it she had seen from him in 2 days, a movement at the corner of his mouth that came and went quickly, but was real. The fire burned down and was built back up. The men found their positions for the night, and the cabin settled into the particular quiet of a place that has been well used and is resting before the next thing it is required to hold. Edna lay in the bed Harold had built and looked at the ceiling. Harold had put up and listened to the sounds the cabin made in the cold, the familiar settling and breathing of old logs and old stone that she had been listening to for 7 decades and knew as well as she knew her own heartbeat. She was not afraid. The fear was gone, the way a weight is gone when you have finally set it down in the right place. Not temporarily shifted, but actually removed the hands free. She had done what she could do. The letter was in Denver. Croft was at the table with his documents. Gideon Cross and 8 other men were keeping watch through the cold. She closed her eyes. Fletcher was still at the window at midnight when the lights came back. Same position at the tree line, same 2 points of cold light in the dark. But this time they did not stay long. They appeared and studied and went out again in under a minute quicker than the night before, with the efficiency of a man who has already seen what he came to see and has stopped needing to look. Fletcher understood what that meant. A man who was still deciding took his time. A man who had finished deciding did not come back to watch a second time. He came back to confirm. Tomorrow was not coming to ask permission. It was already on its way. Fletcher went to the fire and added the last of the evening's wood and settled back into his position against the wall. The storm outside had fully quieted. The mountains beyond the window were dark and enormous, and entirely indifferent to whatever was going to happen in the morning, which was as it should be. The last hour before dawn is the coldest. Any person who has ever stood a full night's watch in the mountains knows this without being told. The temperature drops one final time in the hour before the sky begins to change, dropping the way a held breath releases, and the cold that comes in that last hour has a different quality than the cold of midnight. It is a finishing cold. A cold that means something is ending and something else is about to begin. Gideon Cross stood on Edna Calloway's porch at 5 in the morning and felt that cold working through his thermal shirt and his vest and the leather cut he had put back on before dawn, and he watched the eastern sky above the mountain ridge for the first gray suggestion of light. Behind him, through the log walls, he could hear the cabin waking. Amos was at the stove, the smell of coffee and something savory moving through the gap under the door. Callum was up, his ankle wrapped tight. Moving with a limp, he was managing through concentrated will. Fletcher was at the window that faced the service road where he had been for most of the night, watching with the steady patience of a man who had learned that the most important things appeared when you stopped straining to see them. Croft had slept on the sofa in his cashmere overcoat, with his briefcase on the floor beside him, one hand resting on the handle, and he had been awake before Gideon, sitting up in the dark, reviewing documents by flashlight, with the focused concentration of a man running through arguments he had already constructed and could not stop refining. Edna's door opened at 5:30. She came out dressed, not in her housecoat or her robe. She was dressed in the clothes she wore to church on the Sundays when the weather was good enough to make the drive down the mountain. A dark wool skirt and a white blouse with a cameo pin at the collar that had belonged to her mother. Good shoes, the ones she kept polished in their box on the closet shelf. And on her head, angled with the deliberateness of a woman who had given the matter genuine thought, a hat with a purple feather that curved down along the left side of the brim. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked at the room full of men. The men looked back at her. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Amos said quietly and with complete sincerity, "Miss Edna, you look like someone the devil himself would think twice about." Edna smoothed the front of her skirt. "Sit down and eat," she said. "We have a long morning." They ate at the table and on the floor, and standing at the counter, 8 men and a lawyer, and a 74-year-old woman in her Sunday clothes. And the meal was eggs and toast, and the last of the bacon and coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in. Nobody spoke much because there was not much left to say. The plan was made. The documents were organized in Croft's briefcase in the precise sequence they would be needed. The calls that needed to be made had been made the previous evening, and the people on the other end of those calls had said what they needed to say. At 7:15, Edna went to the window. She stood there for a moment looking out at her land. The snow from the blizzard covered everything deep and brilliant white in the early light, and the pine trees on the north slope carried their loads of snow on every branch with the patient endurance of things accustomed to bearing weight. The mountains behind it all were clear and enormous and permanent, in the way mountains are permanent, which is to say they had been there before any of this began and would be there long after everything that was happening today had become history. She said Harold's name very quietly. Not a prayer exactly, and not quite a conversation. Just his name the way you say the name of someone who is not in the room but has never entirely left it either. She turned back to the room. "Let's go," she said. The Pine Creek Town Hall was a converted gymnasium attached to the elementary school on the main road through town, a building that smelled of floor wax and old coffee, and the particular institutional quality of a space that had absorbed decades of community gathering without being transformed by any of it. The folding chairs were the same ones from 1978. The fluorescent lights still buzzed at a frequency that gave susceptible people headaches. The stage at the far end still carried the painted forest backdrop from the school's last theatrical production that nobody had gotten around to taking down. By 8:30 in the morning, it was packed to the walls. Douglas Merritt had been thorough, and he had been busy. The story moving through Pine Creek in the previous 24 hours was the story of a crisis. An elderly woman, possibly not in full command of her faculties, had been taken over by a group of dangerous transients, members of a notorious motorcycle club with a history of violence. The sheriff had attempted to execute a lawful order and had been met with threats and turned away. The situation had deteriorated. The community needed to act before it worsened. Pine Creek was a small town, and small towns run on narrative, on the story currently moving from household to household, and Douglas Merritt understood this the way he understood most useful things about human nature, as a mechanism that could be operated by someone who knew where the levers were. He had put the right words in the right ears, and the story had done what stories do in small towns. It had grown. It had shed its complications and its ambiguities and become the version people already knew how to feel about. Innocent woman in danger, threatening outsiders, community under siege. 230 people in that gymnasium were frightened and angry, and certain, which is always the most dangerous combination available to a man who knows how to use it. Merritt stood at the podium in his best dark suit, the one he wore when he needed people to feel they were in the presence of serious authority. Sheriff Boyd Merritt stood behind him to the right in full uniform hat, in-hand expression, arranged to project controlled concern. 3 town council members sat at a table to the left, also in good clothes, also with expressions of controlled concern. The television camera from the regional news station in Colorado Springs was set up at the back of the room. Merritt had called them the previous afternoon. He had been specific about the time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, and the buzzing in the room subsided into attention. "We are facing a situation this morning that demands our collective response as a community. One of our own, Edna Rose Calloway, a widow and a longtime member of this town, is being held on her property against her will by individuals who have already demonstrated their willingness to use force against lawful authority." The room murmured. Someone near the front said something under their breath that carried the weight of agreement. "The county holds a legitimate and properly issued legal order," Merritt continued. "We have attempted to execute this order humanely and responsibly, with full regard for Mrs. Calloway's well-being and her dignity as a member of this community. We have been met with threats and obstruction at every turn. I am asking this council today to authorize whatever measures are necessary to resolve this situation, to remove the individuals unlawfully occupying that property, and to ensure the safety of Edna Calloway and the people of Pine Creek." He paused. He looked out at the room with the expression of a man who wanted nothing more than peace and was prepared to do whatever difficult circumstances required of him. He was very good at this expression. He had been constructing it for 2 decades, and it had served him well in rooms like this one. The council members were nodding. The room was nodding. The camera was running. Everything was proceeding according to the plan Douglas Merritt had been building for 18 months, the plan that ended with 47 acres of mountain land in county hands and $40 million moving toward an account registered in a name that traced back to him through 3 layers of corporate structure. He was drawing breath to continue when the doors at the back of the gymnasium opened. The sound they made was not dramatic. They were the same hollow core gymnasium doors they had always been opening, with the ordinary mechanical sound of a push bar being engaged and a rush of cold air from outside. Not a dramatic sound at all. But the room turned. It turned the way rooms turn when the thing that changes the weight of a space occurs, when what everyone was oriented toward is suddenly no longer the most important thing present. Edna Rose Calloway walked through those doors. She walked the way she had walked all her life, spine straight, and each step placed with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had navigated icy mountain paths for 7 decades and had no intention of falling. She was small. She was 74 years old. She was wearing her Sunday clothes and her mother's cameo and her hat with the purple feather curved down along the brim. And she walked down the center aisle of the Pine Creek Town Hall Gymnasium with her hand resting lightly on the arm of a very large man in a navy suit, and she looked at the 230 people in that room with the eyes of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was not going to waste a single second of it. Behind her came 8 men. They were not wearing leather. They were wearing button-down shirts in varying degrees of fit, in slacks and dress shoes that in several cases had clearly been purchased that morning from the general merchandise store on Route 9. Callum was wearing a blue Oxford that was slightly too large in the shoulders, but he wore it with the serious dignity of someone who understood the occasion. Amos's dress shirt, the largest size the store had carried, was doing considerable structural work across the chest and shoulders. Fletcher had found a bolo tie somewhere and had committed to it completely and without apology. They did not look like the photographs that newspapers ran when they wrote about motorcycle clubs. They looked like the largest and most weathered church choir in the recorded history of the state of Colorado. And beside Edna, on her left side, walked Augustus Croft in his cashmere overcoat with his briefcase in his hand. The room was absolutely still. Douglas Merritt stood at the podium and watched Edna Rose Calloway walk toward him down the center aisle of his carefully arranged proceeding, and felt for the first time in 18 months of careful construction the specific cold sensation of a plan beginning to come apart at the seams he had thought were strongest. "She looks fine," someone near the back of the room said. The words moved through the crowd like a current finding its channel. "That's Edna. I thought they said she was—" "She doesn't look like she needs saving to me." Edna walked to the stage stairs. She climbed them without assistance, though Gideon's hand was present at her elbow, close without being intrusive, available without being presumed upon. She crossed the stage and stood at the podium and looked at Douglas Merritt directly, and Merritt, to his credit, did not step back. He was a man who had survived 2 decades in politics by maintaining composure under circumstances that would have broken less practiced performers, and he kept his expression arranged and his voice calibrated. "Mrs. Calloway," he said into the microphone, "we were just discussing your situation. I'm so relieved to see that your—" Edna put her hand on the microphone. She did not snatch it or push him aside. She simply placed her hand on it with the quiet authority of a woman in her own house, redirecting a guest who had been talking long enough, and Merritt, through the pure social reflex of a man who had spent his life reading rooms, stopped talking. Edna looked out at the 230 people who had come to this gymnasium this morning. "This man," she said, "told you my house was falling down." Her voice carried without effort, the voice of a woman who had spent decades calling across mountain distances, a voice that knew how to find its destination. "He told you I had lost my mind. He told you these men were holding me against my will and that I needed to be rescued from my own home." She let the room hold that for a moment. "When the blizzard hit," she said, "when the power went out and the roads washed, and the temperature dropped to 12 below. Where was Douglas Merritt? The room was silent. He was in his warm house, Edna said, with his good fireplace and his good whiskey, while I was alone on a mountain in a blizzard with a broken heating system and an eviction notice on my kitchen table. She looked at the men arranged across the front of the gymnasium. These men came to my door in that storm, she said, not to threaten me, not to take anything that belonged to me. They came because their road was gone, and I had a fire and I offered them shelter. And they repaid that shelter by getting on my roof in the cold and clearing the snow load that could have collapsed it, by going under my house in the dark and fixing what had been deliberately broken, by cooking my breakfast and standing between me and the people who wanted to drag me out of my home in the middle of a winter storm. She looked back at the room. Douglas Merritt wants you to be afraid of them, she said, because as long as you are looking at them, you are not looking at him. She stepped back from the podium. Croft moved. He crossed the stage with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this in many rooms over many years and had learned that speed and calm in combination creates something very difficult to interrupt. He set 2 documents on the table in front of the council members and held a third up so the room could see it clearly. My name is Augustus Croft, he said. I am an attorney licensed in the states of Illinois and Colorado and 3 others. I have been retained by Mrs. Calloway in connection with the condemnation order issued against her property at 4471 Mountain View Road. He held up the first document. This is a wire transfer record dated 11 months ago. A sum of $240,000 was transferred from a subsidiary of Pacific Crest Water Corporation, a California-based water extraction company, to a Delaware limited liability company called Mountain Ridge Holdings. The sole managing member of Mountain Ridge Holdings is Sheriff Boyd Merritt. The room erupted. Not all at once, but in a wave starting near the front, where people could read Croft's certainty in his face and his posture and moving backward through the room as the information reached people in sequence. And they turned to their neighbors, and the sound built into something that pressed against the gymnasium walls. Boyd Merritt, in his uniform and his hat, and his carefully maintained expression went the color of old chalk. Croft waited. He was practiced at waiting. He had learned decades ago that a room that is erupting will settle if you give it enough time and do not try to force it, and that the silence after the eruption is more useful than anything you could have said into the noise. He held up the second document. This is the inspection report that generated the condemnation order against the Calloway property. It bears the signature of a licensed structural inspector in the state of Colorado named Raymond Holt. He reached into the briefcase. This is Raymond Holt's death certificate. He held both up simultaneously so the council members at their table could see them side by side. The inspection report dated 14 months after the death certificate, both signatures visible at the same distance. Raymond Holt died of cardiac arrest in Denver 14 months before this inspection report was written. He did not inspect this property. He did not assess this foundation. He did not write this report. Someone forged his signature on a federal inspection document to manufacture a legal basis for seizing a widow's home and the land beneath it. He set both documents on the table in front of the council. Forging a federal inspection document is a felony, Croft said. His voice had not changed in volume or tempo through any of this. It was the voice of a man who knew that facts delivered steadily carry more weight than facts delivered with emotion. Conspiracy to commit property fraud is a felony. Using a public office to advance a direct personal financial interest constitutes abuse of that office and is a felony. The evidence I have presented has already been forwarded in full to the FBI field office in Denver. The room had gone past noise into something more fundamental, a sustained collective sound that was beyond individual words, the sound of 200 people simultaneously revising their understanding of what was true and what they had been used for. Douglas Merritt moved. He came across the stage faster than a man in an expensive suit should have been able to move his hand outstretched toward the documents on the council table, his face stripped of every layer of the performance he had spent years perfecting. What was underneath was not something more appealing. It was smaller and more honest and considerably less composed. "Give me those," he said, and his voice had lost everything smooth about it. Amos Bridwell stepped in front of the council table. He did not reach for Merritt. He did not raise his hands or make any gesture that could be described as threatening. He simply moved from where he was standing to where Merritt needed to go and stood there, and the laws of physics did the rest. Merritt hit him at full stride and came back off him, the way a man comes back off a wall he did not see, rebounding and stumbling sideways with his arms moving in wide arcs, searching for balance at the edge of the stage. Fletcher Boone's foot was there. It was a quiet extension a few inches in a particular direction, the kind of precise small movement that a man with quick reflexes and a certain dry appreciation for the geometry of situations might accomplish without appearing to do anything deliberate at all. Merritt's leading foot caught it, and his trailing foot had nowhere to go, and he went down. He hit the gymnasium floor face first in front of 230 voters and a television camera from Colorado Springs, and the sound he made was not the sound a man should make in a public setting, and the laughter that moved through the room was not the gentle kind. Edna looked down at Douglas Merritt on the gymnasium floor. She had known this man for 11 years. She had watched him stand at podiums and shake hands and arrange his face into whatever expression the occasion required, sincerity or gravity, or neighborly concern, whichever version of himself was most useful at any given moment. She had watched him the way you watch someone who wants something you have, with the steady, patient attention of a woman who has learned that what people want tells you more about them than anything they choose to say. He looked up at her from the floor, and even then, even in that moment with the composure entirely gone, and the floor underneath him, in the room watching the calculation, tried to reassemble itself in his face. The reflex of a man who has always believed there is an angle available if he can only find it quickly enough. "There is no angle here," Douglas Edna said. She was not angry when she said it. She was tired in the specific way you are tired when something that has required enormous sustained effort is finally conclusively finished. The tiredness of completion rather than the tiredness of defeat. The doors at the back of the gymnasium opened again. These opened differently. They opened with the particular authority of people who are accustomed to doors opening for them, and the four people who came through wore the specific clothing and carried themselves with the specific bearing of federal agents arriving at a location where federal authority has been requested and is now being exercised. The room parted for them the way rooms always part for that particular combination of posture and purpose. The lead agent was a woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and the expression of someone who had driven a considerable distance and was ready to complete her morning's work. She walked to the council table and examined the documents Croft had arranged. She looked at them carefully and thoroughly, which took longer than the room was comfortable with, and then she looked at Croft. "Mr. Croft," she said. "Agent Mercer," Croft said. "I believe you have something for us." "I believe I have several things for you," Croft said. He picked up the briefcase. Agent Dana Mercer paused. She turned and looked at Edna directly. Not with the look people give elderly women they have come to assist or protect, but with the look you give someone you have been waiting to meet, someone whose existence has been peripheral to something you have been working on for long enough that encountering them in person has a particular quality of completion. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I want you to know something." The room that had been full of sound was now very quiet. 3 months ago, Agent Mercer said a package arrived at our Denver field office. Sent certified mail return address, Pine Creek, Colorado. It contained a property survey, a copy of the Pacific Crest Water Acquisition Inquiry filed with the State Water Rights Board, copies of county council meeting records going back 4 years, documentation of survey crew activity on and around your property, and a handwritten summary of Douglas Merritt's conduct in known associations, cross-referenced by date. She paused. "It was one of the most thoroughly organized pieces of preliminary documentation I have received in 21 years of federal service. Every claim was supported. Every date was verified. The cross-referencing alone would have taken a trained analyst the better part of a week." She looked at Edna steadily. "That package came from you." The gymnasium was absolutely silent. 230 people held the specific stillness of an audience that has just understood something it did not understand a moment before. Edna looked at Agent Mercer with an expression that gave nothing away, and everything at once the expression of a woman who has done what she set out to do and is neither surprised nor particularly interested in being congratulated for it. I have been watching that man for 4 years, Edna said. I just needed someone with the authority to do something about what I was watching. Gideon looked at her. He stood very still for a long moment. She looked back at him without apology and without anything performed about the moment. You called Croft, she said. I called Denver. We both made our calls. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had something in it that had not been audible before. Something that was not quite any of the things it resembled, but that Edna understood anyway because she had heard it before in the voices of men who had encountered something that revised their understanding of what a person could be. How long, he said. How long had you been planning this? Edna smoothed the front of her skirt. Since the day the check arrived in the envelope with the condemnation notice, she said. A man who tries to buy what he is already planning to steal tells you exactly what kind of man he is, and exactly how afraid he is of you. She stepped off the stage without waiting for a response. The men and women who had come to this gymnasium believing they were there to support an action found themselves understanding in that moment that what they had witnessed was not a rescue. Edna Rose Calloway had not needed rescuing. She had needed witnesses and an audience and a room full of her neighbors to see what she had already arranged to be seen. She had built this proceeding the way her father had built on that land deliberately and from the ground up, knowing what she was making and what it needed to hold. Douglas Merritt was helped to his feet by two of the agents. His composure was entirely gone, replaced by something smaller and more honest. He looked at the room of people who had come to his meeting and saw in their faces the particular expression of an audience that has watched a performance and understood too late which direction the performance was actually running. He looked at Edna. This isn't finished, he said. His voice had recovered some of its smoothness through pure habit, the reflex of a man whose instrument was his voice and who reached for it automatically. The law is still on my side. Edna looked at him. The law, she said, and her voice was clear and reached every corner of that gymnasium without effort, without strain the way it had always reached wherever it needed to go. Maybe. She let the word stand by itself for a moment. But justice is mine. They took Douglas Merritt out of the Pine Creek Town Hall in handcuffs at 9:47 in the morning, and they took Boyd Merritt out 7 minutes later, and the television camera from Colorado Springs recorded both exits in full, and the recording ran on the regional news that evening and was picked up by the national feed by the following morning. The story that ran was not the story Douglas Merritt had spent 18 months constructing. It was a different story entirely, and it had a different protagonist. Gideon was beside Edna when the doors closed behind the agents. He looked at her. She was looking at the doors with the expression of a woman setting down something she has been carrying for a long time, feeling the specific relief of hands that are finally free. Told you, he said quietly. Edna looked at him. Told me what? That bullies count on their targets being alone. Edna was quiet for a moment. I was never entirely alone, she said. I had Harold's house and my father's land and 74 years of knowing exactly what I was standing on. She looked at Gideon. You just made it harder for them to pretend otherwise. The men stayed one more day. Edna had expected them to leave that afternoon after the handcuffs and the cameras and all the machinery of consequence that Croft had set in motion. She had expected them to go back to whatever they had been going to before the blizzard caught them, the road to Utah, the funeral they had been trying to reach the lives they lived in the spaces between. Instead, they stayed. They split wood in the afternoon until there was enough stacked against the north wall of the cabin to carry through 3 hard winters. Amos packed the woodshed with the methodical precision of someone building something meant to endure, fitting each piece to the space available, the way a careful man fits things together. Fletcher repaired the gutter on the east side that had been pulling away from the fascia since the previous summer, working with the focused attention he brought to most things that required his hands. Callum, under firm instruction to keep his ankle elevated, sat on the porch and sorted hardware from Harold's old toolbox into labeled mason jars with a seriousness that made it clear he found the work genuinely satisfying rather than merely useful. Gideon spent part of the afternoon under the cabin again checking the previous day's work, adding brackets in two places where the wood had aged in ways that would eventually require attention. He did it the way he did most things, quietly and without making a production of the doing. By evening, the cabin was in better structural condition than it had been in 15 years. At dusk, they gathered on the porch. The mountains were doing what they do at dusk in winter, turning colors that have no precise names in any standard vocabulary, the pink and the amber and the particular shade of purple-gray that comes in the last minutes before the cold dark settles in for the night. The valley below was already in shadow. Up on the mountain, the last light held a little longer the way it always does at elevation, as though the height makes it worth keeping a moment more. Edna stood at the porch railing and looked at her land. She looked at the meadow where the aquifer ran deep beneath the snow, the meadow her father had walked when he first stood on what was his. She looked at the pine grove on the north slope where Harold had built the bench so she could sit on Sunday mornings and watch the mountains come into their light. She looked at the mountains themselves and the sky going purple and dark above them, and she thought that Elias Dupree, standing on this ground in 1919 with the deed in his hands and 19 years of railroad work behind him, would have found this week satisfactory. All things considered. Gideon came and stood beside her at the railing. They stood without talking for a while, which was easy between them by now. He was a man who did not fill silence for the sake of filling it, who understood that some of the most important exchanges between people happen in the spaces between words, and Edna had always known the same. He reached into the interior of his vest and held something in his open palm before he spoke. "There is something we do in the club," he said, "when we find someone who deserves to be looked after, who has earned what that means." He paused. "We don't do it often. It is not given lightly." He opened his hand fully. It was a patch small the size of a playing card, dark fabric with a design embroidered in red thread. A heart with a dagger through it, simple, and without the elaborate insignia on their cuts. "It means this property is a sanctioned stop," Gideon said. "Any Iron Son anywhere in the country sees this on your door, he knows this place is under protection. He knows who to contact if anything happens here." He looked at her. "And it means family. Our kind of family, which I understand is an unusual thing to offer, and maybe a stranger thing to receive." Edna looked at the patch in his palm. She thought about a night 3 days ago when she had stood on these porch steps in a blizzard with a kerosene lantern and made a decision about what kind of woman she was going to be, about the freezing men on her road. She thought about Harold's voice in her head, clear as a struck bell. She thought about the check burning in the grate and the envelope on its way to Denver, and everything that had followed from those two acts, the long chain of consequence that had led to this porch and this evening, and this man standing beside her with something in his open hand. She held out her hand. Gideon placed the patch in her palm. He took a pin from his vest pocket and pinned it carefully to the lapel of her Sunday coat, the coat she had put on that morning when she decided what kind of morning it was going to be. He stepped back. "For life," he said. Edna touched the patch with her fingertips. It was heavier than it looked. Things that meant something usually were. Amos appeared in the doorway behind them, filling it the way he filled most doorways completely. "Miss Edna," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had been working up to something and had finally decided the time for working up was done. He looked at the mountains and then back at her. "We were talking." He paused. "If it would be all right with you, could we come back next winter?" He looked at his boots for a moment. "We'd bring the shovels," he said. Edna looked at Amos Bridwell, at his enormous tattooed hands and his bald head and his face that had clearly been through things she was glad she had not been required to go through. And she thought about him standing at her stove in Harold's apron, making blueberry pancakes from his grandmother's recipe. The grandmother who had taught him in Alabama that you judge a man by whether he pays attention to the small things. "You bring the shovels," she said. "I'll have the syrup ready." The 9 men left the next morning. They went down the service road and onto the mountain highway. 9 Harley Davidsons in the gray early light, with exhaust rising in white plumes in the cold air. The snow from the blizzard was beginning to soften where the sun reached the road, and the valley below was visible for the first time in 4 days, laid out in the brilliant clarity that comes after a storm has washed the air clean. Edna stood on the porch and watched them go. Gideon was last. He stopped at the end of the service road where it met the highway and looked back at the cabin. Edna was a small figure on the porch, a slight woman in a coat with a patch on the lapel standing on the land her father had bought and her husband had loved, and 3 men had tried to take from her and failed. Gideon raised his fist. Edna raised her hand. He turned onto the highway and was gone. The silence came back, but it was not the same silence that had occupied this cabin before the blizzard. That silence had been the silence of a woman alone with her history and her determination in a house where someone used to be. This silence had something in it that had not been present before, a quality of being held, rather than simply empty the way a space feels when it is known and claimed and looked after. Edna went inside and sat in Harold's rocking chair and put her hand on the arm where his hands had worn the wood smooth over 41 years. She looked at the fireplace and listened to the cabin settling around her in the morning cold. She was still here. The land was still here. The years that followed became their own kind of story, the sort that accumulates slowly and is only visible as a whole when you step back far enough to see the entire shape of it. The December after the blizzard, motorcycle engines came again to Pine Creek. Not 9 this time, but 50. They came down Road 9 in a column the town heard long before it saw, and they brought turkeys and Christmas trees strapped to handlebars and boxes of toys for the children's home outside town. They brought a professional-grade generator for Edna, and Amos installed it in an afternoon while Edna fed everyone cornbread and chili and refused assistance in the kitchen with the same authority she had refused it the night they arrived. The year after that, there were more. Then more still. By 2005, it had a name: the Edna Run. The town of Pine Creek, which had once watched from behind curtain windows while 9 bikers drove up the mountain road, now marked the date on community calendars. The diner prepared extra food the week before. The gas station brought in additional fuel. The elementary school ran a project where the children made cards to give to the riders when they came through, and the riders kept those cards, and several of them were found in jacket pockets at funerals years later, carried without anyone being told. The world, it turned out, was capable of revision. It only needed a sufficient reason. There were years when Pine Creek itself changed around the cabin without the cabin changing. The diner on Main Road changed hands twice, and the gas station got new pumps, and the elementary school added a wing that doubled its capacity and brought in families from the surrounding valleys who had never known Pine Creek when it was a town that watched strangers from behind curtains. The children of those new families grew up knowing the Edna Run, the way children know the things that have always been true as fact, rather than story, as part of the landscape, rather than something that required explanation. They knew that in December, the road filled with motorcycles, and that this was good and right, and that the woman on the mountain was the reason. And when they asked their parents why, the parents told them about a blizzard and a lantern and a door open to strangers in the dark, and the children understood in the way children understand things that are simple and true, that the door was the whole story, that everything else followed from the door. Edna herself did not speak much about any of it in her later years. She was not a woman who narrated her own life back to herself or to anyone else. She had done what she had done, and the land was still there, and the cabin was still standing, and the people who mattered knew what they needed to know. She sat in the rocking chair Harold had made for her and watched the mountains in the mornings and drank her coffee while it was still hot and let the years accumulate around her, the way snow accumulates quietly and without any single flake announcing itself. Until one morning, you look out the window and everything has been transformed, and you cannot say exactly when it happened, only that it did, and that the ground beneath it all is still the same ground it has always been. In the summer of 2003, 3 men came up the mountain road after dark and broke the lock on Harold's hay barn. They were looking for tools or equipment or whatever the barn might contain that was worth carrying off. Edna heard them from the house and put on her coat and walked to the barn and opened the door and turned on the light. On the wall, on a piece of oak board that Gideon had sealed with varnish and nailed up 6 years earlier, was a sign hand-lettered in black paint. It read, "This property protected by Iron Sons MC. Trespassers will regret the decision." The three men looked at the sign and laughed. They stopped laughing when they heard the engine. A single motorcycle idling at the far end of the service road. Not moving, just present a young prospect named Rafferty, who had been assigned to the Pine Creek watch rotation for the month, sitting in the dark at the end of the road with his headlight on, looking at the barn with the patient attention of someone who understood his job and was doing it. He did not come up the road. He did not have to. The three men left with such urgency that they forgot the bolt cutters they had brought with them. Edna found them in the morning and put them in the barn where they were useful, which was what Harold would have done. The chapter rotated prospects through the Pine Creek area on a schedule that Edna was not precisely informed of and did not ask about. She noticed over the years when someone new was doing it, and when someone she recognized came back, and she left coffee on the porch railing on cold nights, and in the morning the coffee was gone, and the cup was rinsed and turned upside down beside the railing, and that was the whole of the exchange, which suited both parties exactly. In the spring of 2007, Callum Hess came up the mountain road in a truck instead of on a motorcycle, and Edna knew before he got out of the vehicle that something was different. He was 35 years old, and he had a woman with him, small and dark-haired and watchful, in the specific way of someone who has learned that paying close attention is a form of protection. And he had a bundle in his arms that he carried with the particular careful terror of a man holding something he is not yet fully confident he deserves to hold. He brought the baby up to the porch and placed her in Edna's arms. "Her name is Edna Rose Hess," he said. Edna held the baby and looked at Callum, at the young man who had lain on her sofa with a sprained ankle on the worst night of his life, looking up at her with his young face full of something that wanted very much to be hope. The young man who had had nowhere to go before he had somewhere to go. "She's beautiful," Edna said. "She has your ears, which you should probably apologize to her for at some point." Callum laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of someone who is uncomplicated happy, in a way that does not require explanation or defense. Edna thought it was one of the finest sounds she had heard in quite some time. Fletcher Boone died in the spring of 2010. It was cancer, the slow and systematic kind that announces itself early and does not hurry. He had known for 2 years before anyone outside the club knew, because Fletcher had been private about most things, and his dying was no exception to that habit. He rode until he could not, and then he stopped and moved into a house near the Denver chapter and received visitors until that was no longer practical, and Gideon was with him at the end. 2 weeks before he died, Fletcher wrote letters, one to Gideon, one to his sister in Montana, one to Edna Rose Calloway in Pine Creek, Colorado. Edna read hers at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in April, with the window open and the smell of snow melt and first earth coming in off the mountain. The letter was not long. Fletcher had not been a man who practiced the expression of himself on paper, and the effort showed in the careful block letters, but not in a way that diminished anything. It read, "Mrs. Calloway, I am not good at saying things the right way in writing, but I want you to know that the night we came to your door was one of the best things that happened to me in a long time. You were not afraid of us, and you were not nice to us the way people are sometimes nice when they want something from you. You were just decent. You treated us like men worth being decent to. I have thought about that more times than I can count. You were the first person outside the club in a long time who made me feel like a person worth treating that way, and I am grateful to you for it more than I know how to put down right. Fletcher Boone." Edna read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and placed it in the box where she kept the things she intended to keep the box with Harold's letters from before they were married, and Elias's railroad company identification card, and her mother's cameo, and the photographs of people she had loved. She kept Fletcher Boone's letter in that box until the day she died. The winters passed. The cabin held. Edna held made of the same materials as the foundation Harold had laid, the kind that takes pressure over time and becomes denser and more permanent for it the kind that does not give way when tested, but reveals what it has always been made of. Gideon came every December with the run and stayed an extra day to walk the property and check the structure, doing it the way he did most things, without ceremony. His hair went gray and then white. The lines in his face accumulated into the particular geography of a man who has carried significant things for a long time and has not set them down. He became chapter president in 2004 and wore that the way he wore everything else important, without making a performance of it. He and Edna sat by the fire every December and talked about Harold and about the land and about the things Gideon had seen in the years since the blizzard. And sometimes they talked about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that only happens between people who have been through something together and emerged on the other side, trusting each other with silence. The winter of 2014 came in hard. Edna was 91 years old. The rocking chair moved more slowly now. The mornings took longer than they used to. Her mind was clear and her eyes were still sharp, but her body had arrived at its own conclusions and was moving in a direction she understood with the equanimity of a woman who had spent her life in mountain country where everything that lived eventually returned to the ground, and the ground was not something to be afraid of. Gideon had arranged the nursing rotation the previous year, 2 women who came through on a weekly schedule, staying in the cabin so that Edna would not have to leave it. She had agreed to this with only minor argument, which Gideon understood as more significant than if she had agreed easily. She wanted to be in the cabin. She wanted to die in the bed Harold had built in the house her father had made on the land that Elias Dupree had purchased with the wages of his own labor and his own refusal to accept that some things were beyond what a man like him could reach for. The nurse called Gideon on a Tuesday afternoon in February. "It's time," she said. He was on the road within the hour. He did not put it on any public channel. He used the wire, the old informal network that ran underneath the official structure of the club. The word of mouth and phone call and message passed hand to hand that had connected the chapters since before most of the current members were old enough to ride. The message was 5 words. The matriarch is going home. By the time Gideon reached Pine Creek, the highway was already beginning to fill. Edna Rose Calloway died that Tuesday night in February of 2014 in the bed Harold Calloway had built in the autumn of 1953, in the room where she had been born in the winter of 1923, in the house that her father had built with his own hands on the land he had purchased, with the wages of 19 years on the railroad, because he wanted something that was his and could not be taken from him. She died looking at the mountains through the window Harold had framed for her, the mountains that had been there before any of this began and would be there long after. The funeral was Saturday. By 7 in the morning, the highway patrol had closed the main road into town. By 8, the columns of motorcycles stretched past any point from which the end was visible. They came from California and Utah and Wyoming and Nebraska, and from states further than those. They came alone and in groups and in full chapter formations with the tight precision of people who had been riding together for a long time. Clubs that had been active rivals for 30 years rode side by side with their colors lowered because the woman they had come for had never concerned herself with the distinctions between them, and they were not going to dishonor her memory by making those distinctions matter today. 3,000 motorcycles. The sound they made filled the valley and bounced back from the mountain faces, changed and layered into something that had not been heard in this part of Colorado before. At Pine Creek Cemetery, the crowd spread over the hill and down the other side. Gideon Cross stood at the edge of the grave in his cut the president patch, worn soft from years of constant wearing. He had considered wearing a suit. He had decided against it. He had worn this cut to every important thing in his life for 25 years. And this was the most important, and he was going to wear it. He had not prepared words because there were no words adequate to what he was thinking, and he had spent 2 days trying to find them, and they had not come, and he had finally understood that the words were not the point. They had never been the point. He reached into the inside pocket of his cut. The paper was soft from years of being folded and unfolded, from being taken out and looked at many times, not out of triumph, but out of the need to verify that the night in the blizzard was real, that the woman who had opened her door and fed them stew and pointed at their boots and told them to take them off was real and had been real all of these years. The condemnation order, Douglas Merritt's signature at the bottom in the ink of a man who had believed he was untouchable. The 15th of December, 1997, circled in red. Merritt had served 7 years in federal prison on charges that included forgery of federal documents, conspiracy to commit property fraud, and multiple counts of abuse of public office. Pacific Crest Water Corporation had settled with the Colorado Water Rights Board and withdrawn entirely from operations in the state. Boyd Merritt had lost his badge and his freedom for 4 years and everything else of value to him not long after. The Callaway property remained exactly as it had always been. Gideon looked at the paper one final time. He placed it on the casket. He reached into the other pocket and took out a single white rose, the only kind the Pine Creek florist had in stock that February morning, and placed it beside the letter. He stood with his hand resting on the casket for a moment. "Ride easy, Ma," he said. "We got the watch from here." 3,000 engines started. Not simultaneously, but in a wave, the way the sound had built when they arrived, finding its rhythm growing from a few to many, to something that was no longer individual machines, but a single collective voice. A sound that filled the valley from wall to wall and rose up the mountain faces and scattered snow from the high branches and traveled outward in every direction until there was no place in Pine Creek where it could not be felt moving through the body. It was not noise. Noise is what happens when sound has no intention behind it. This had intention. This was 3,000 people saying a name in the only language they had that was adequate to what they meant in the idiom of the engine and the road, and the miles that accumulate into a life and a loyalty and a promise made in a blizzard that was never going to be retracted. Saying thank you and goodbye, and we remember, and we were changed by knowing you, and we will not forget. It was the loudest prayer ever offered in the Rocky Mountains. It shook the windows of every house in Pine Creek. It moved through the frozen ground. It lasted a long time. The cabin is still there. It stands on 47 acres of mountain land outside Pine Creek, Colorado, on the ground that Elias Dupree purchased in 1919 with cash he had saved over 19 years on the railroad, the land his daughter kept for 74 years against everything that tried to take it from her. No developer has come to claim it since. The legal status of the property is a matter of complete public record, and the community of people who care about it is not one that anyone in the business of acquisition has found it practical to challenge. The garden is tended by a rotating group of people from town who took it on after Edna died and have not stopped. The roof is sound, the porch is solid, the rocking chair sits beside the fireplace in the place it has always occupied, shaped to fit a woman who no longer needs it and will not be sitting in it again and is present in it nonetheless. There is a bronze plaque on the front wall beside the door placed there by an anonymous trust administered out of Chicago. If you pressed Augustus Croft about it, he would neither confirm nor deny his involvement, which was itself a sufficient confirmation for those who understood how Croft operated. The plaque does not list dates or accomplishments or positions held. It says Edna Rose Callaway. She offered shelter to the storm, and the storm became her shield. On cold winter nights in Pine Creek, when the wind comes down off the mountain, the way it came down in December of 1997, and the temperature drops hard and the snow comes sideways, the people who live in the valley below will sometimes hear something that might be the wind finding the gaps in the tree line, or might be something else entirely. A low sound moving, circling the property line with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who has made a commitment and intends to keep it regardless of the weather or the hour or how many years have passed since the commitment was made. The locals know what it is. They have known for a long time. They turn over in their warm beds, or they stand at their windows and look up toward the mountain, and they feel the vibration in their chests, and they settle back into sleep without fear, because they know exactly what the sound means and exactly who it is for. It means the watch is kept. It means the promise made in a blizzard in the winter of 1997 by a woman with a lantern and 9 men who stayed was not the kind of promise that has an expiration date. It means that somewhere up on that mountain on the land, a railroad man bought with the wages of his labor, and that his daughter held for 74 years against everything that tried to take it, the storm that came to destroy has been standing guard instead, as it always will.